Welcome to the afternoon session, the roundtable on Canadian constitutionalism, prospects and challenges, appropriately chaired by an immigrant. My name is Victor Muñiz-Fraticelli. I want to reiterate the words that Professor Jacob Levy mentioned at the beginning of the conference, and thank you all for participating in this event. I'll keep the introductions brief. Kelly Gordon is Assistant Professor of Political Science at McGill, whose research focuses on gender and politics, feminist political theory, and Canadian politics. Philipe Lagassé is Associate Professor and Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. His research is mostly on defense policy and procurement and relations between Parliament, the Executive, and the Crown. Christopher Manfredi is Professor of Political Science and current Provost and Vice Principal Academic at McGill and writes on judicial politics and constitutional theory. Both Kelly and Chris are members of the Research Group for Constitutional Studies, and Philippe is a past participant in the RGCS lecture series. So we're among family here. Welcome. We'll start with 15-minute presentations, followed by some conversation between the participants, and end with some questions from the attendees. I ask the attendees to use the raise hand function found in the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. That will allow me not only to take notice of you, but also to keep things flowing in the proper order. So without further ado, I turn over the floor to Kelly.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone had a nice lunch. I want to thank Victor and Jacob for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on this roundtable. All right, so we were asked to speak about a theme surrounding challenges to Canadian constitutionalism, and I'm from Alberta originally and have been watching my home province now from afar as like a newly minted Laurentian elite. I've been watching my home province kind of navigate contemporary politics, particularly following the 2019 federal election, and maybe with some concern. So what we're seeing in the western part of the country is in some ways maybe like a return to the 1990s, a period of intense constitutional debate. We've seen the resurgence of the Bloc Québécois, concurrent Liberal governments with little to no support in the western part of the country, and rising levels of interprovincial and federal-provincial tensions. I think this is particularly true for Alberta, and the rest. So Alberta and Ottawa and Quebec and BC, and basically Alberta Premier Jason Kenney will sort of fight with anyone. So just yesterday, the Federal Court of Appeal ruled that Alberta has the right to control the amount and destination of oil and other fuels flowing through its pipelines. And this decision, of course, comes in the wake of a battle between Alberta and BC over the so-called turn off the taps legislation enacted by Alberta in 2018 at the height of a dispute between the two provinces over the construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And this decision, one celebrated by Kenney, I think points to growing levels of acrimony between different levels of government and different governments. Ones that I think we can expect to continue to mount, and we're also seeing, around the pandemic response. So I decided to structure my comments, perhaps a little selfishly, around the current rise in Western alienation or Western-based populism. So Canada has often earned accolades abroad for the theory and doctrine of its constitutional law. And there are a number of important institutional explanations for why Canadian constitutionalism has been quite resilient, even in the face of the increasing global phenomenon of democratic decline. And, you never want to be smug about these things, even though Canadians love to be smug. But Canada's constitutional order seems quite equipped at surviving serious shocks while retaining its core purpose. And this has certainly emerged as kind of a popular journalistic talking point over the last several years. But of course, Canadian constitutional democracy has also been beset by a series of domestic challenges that have dominated much of our internal debate. Indeed, the lived experiences of many people in Canada remains one of misgiving, disenchantment, and often understandable anger for a past that remains unreconciled with the present. And I think most notable among these challenges have been, Indigenous self-government and land claims and the related so-called state reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the balance between religious accommodations and other constitutional goods, and of course, the continuing possibility of Quebec succession, although I think Legault's popularity in Quebec has done much to sort of temper the sovereigntist movement. But I guess it's like always, we're only like one provincial election away from this kind of once again reemerging on the horizon. However, perhaps like an undertold part of this story has been the ways that the uneven regional distribution of power outside of Quebec has also contributed to pressures on Canadian constitutionalism. In particular, the regional distribution of seats in Parliament has in many ways undermined the influence of Western parts of the country. And this intermittently has become a major source of intergovernmental tension. This has been particularly true for the Western provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and to a lesser extent, Manitoba and British Columbia, and especially sort of the eastern part of BC. Indeed, the term Western alienation, which generally defines this condition, has become a well-known phrase in the Canadian political lexicon. This phrase, however, I think has taken on new salience following the 2019 federal election, when Trudeau won a minority government without a single seat west of Manitoba. So I thought today I would talk about this challenge, one that's maybe less discussed, this idea of kind of Western alienation or Western-based populism. And recently, of course, there's been a lot of discussion around authoritarian and ethno-national populism, populism that's often centered on ideas of white nationalism. But this form of populism has been less electorally viable in Canada. We saw this with the People's Party in 2019, where Bernier lost his own seat. And there's lots of reasons for this, which we could discuss in the larger discussion. Interestingly, political elites in Canada tend to hold more liberal views on immigration than the larger Canadian public. So it might be likely that elites, certainly at the federal level, have actually curbed and limited the rise of ethno-national populism. But nevertheless, this kind of focus on the ethno-national anti-immigrant contours of populism has maybe risked masking another form of populism, like prairie populism or Western-based populism, which is a much more enduring politically and institutionally significant form of populism in Canada. So I'm going to structure the rest of my comments in kind of two parts and think a little bit about this form of populism and its challenges to the landscape of Canadian politics. And I'll do this in two parts. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of what is Western alienation, why it matters to discussions of Canadian constitutionalism, and then I'll talk a little bit about why it matters now and why I think it's only going to get worse in the coming years. So if, as Pratap argued in the opening roundtable, constitutionalism is about constituting a people and a social order, many, if not most, Western Canadians and certainly Albertans would argue that they've been left out of this social and political order. Right, and rather, Canadian constitutionalism has been more concerned with central Canada and its values and social and economic interests, often to the detriment of Western Canada. And the roots of this kind of political alienation, of course, date back to the integration of Manitoba and the Northwest Territories into Confederation. And while these regions were rich in natural resources, they never had control over those resources, and particularly in the kind of formative stages of their development. This was, for example, obviously the case with the National Policy of 1879, which aimed to promote the industrialization of Canada through, among other things, a construction of a tariff wall between Canada and the US, largely to the benefit of the central part of the country. And this core periphery trend has continued throughout Canada's history, from Pierre Trudeau's National Energy Program, which, like, I assure you, the wounds are still fresh for Albertans. And many, current proponents of Western alienation suggest that this dynamic is also at play with the more recent carbon tax, which they suggest will merely kill jobs out west and increase the cost of everything. So this history, I think, for some good and maybe some exaggerated reasons, has stoked ideas that prairie provinces were simply used to fuel industrial development in central Canada. And this history of uneven economic development has stoked feelings of alienation in Western Canada in notable ways. Western Canadians, more than others, tend to perceive elected representatives, political institutions, and governments, especially in Ottawa, as operating at a distance from their own lives in a way that neither takes into account their views, concerns, and economic interests, nor is responsive to their input. And this has led to a significant lack of political trust and the feeling that Western Canadians do not feel they have the opportunity or institutional capacity to affect decision making. So whether you believe this alienation is real or perceived on the part of Western Canadians, or maybe a little bit of both, there are still reasons to be concerned about this political dynamic and its challenges to constitutionalism. First, Western alienation has historically contributed to significant shakeups in Canada's partisan landscape. So throughout history, the Western provinces have reactively looked to regional and often populist parties which in turn then have stoked conflict between the interests of the people in Western Canada and the elites in Central Canada. And this dynamic has remade the party system on multiple occasions, probably the most notable of which was the creation of the Reform Party in the 1980s, which ultimately took over the Progressive Conservative Party and fundamentally changed the direction of Conservative Party politics. But Western alienation and the intellectual and political infrastructure that has emerged around the concept has also been closely connected to some of the most influential critiques of Canadian constitutionalism, especially in the post-charter era. So this might be a little bit cliche, but perhaps most infamously, there's the so-called Calgary School, which is this group of academics out of the University of Calgary, they are argued to kind of share and promote similar ideas about how political scientists could shape the rise of a particular kind of conservatism in Canada. And so I think it's fair to say that Western Canada, and in particular Alberta, has been the intellectual and spiritual hub not only of Canadian conservatism, but also of some of the most influential critiques of contemporary Canadian conservatism, especially in a post-charter era. And here, we can think in particular of Raynor Knopf, but also Christopher Manfredi's work on the rise of so-called judicial activism. So why does Western alienation matter now in this contemporary moment? So first, the results of the 2019 election is reminiscent of several elections throughout the 80s and 90s, insofar as the results have re-emphasized the regional divisions that exist in Canada. Indeed, the Liberal Party won the election with the lowest vote share in history, and without winning a single seat in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, or BC. This has reminded Western Canadians that the Liberal Party doesn't need any votes from the West to form a government. Moreover, this isn't episodic. This is a historical and, so to speak, permanent dynamic in Canadian politics. Second, there's good reason to believe that feelings of Western alienation are on the rise. So recent polling suggests not only that the majority of Albertans don't feel Ottawa adequately represents their interests. This is something that's come out in survey data for the last 30 years. But just last month, an Angus Reid poll found that over 50% of Albertans said they would support the province's succession from Canada. So, there's reasons maybe to doubt the accuracy of that poll, but just as an interesting point of contrast, a similar poll found that 82% of Quebecers said they had no desire to revisit the idea of sovereignty anytime soon. So it seems like a lot of the alienation is sort of happening in the western part of the country. Third, we're also seeing, once again, new populist movements and parties emerge across Western Canada, most notably in Alberta. So we're seeing this populist trend, I think, within conservative provincial governments, particularly with Jason Kenney, but we're also seeing the emergence of new parties and movements, many of which are disillusioned with both the federal government, but also provincial conservative governments and the federal Conservative Party. So the Wild Rose Party, an Alberta-based party that formed official opposition in 2012, has reemerged on the partisan landscape, although this time under the new name Wild Rose Independence Party. Its website outlines bold challenges to Canadian constitutionalism, including developing an Alberta constitution, controlling its own taxation, pension plans, immigration, natural resources, and so on. It also wants to develop its own military and police force. So whereas the Reform Party's slogan was "the West wants in," this time feels different. It seems the West wants out. Fourth, rising levels of Western alienation have also given rise to new movements like Wexit and the Yellow Vest movement that threaten to align segments of the working class, and particularly in the oil and gas sector, with xenophobic nationalist agendas criticizing global institutions, international cooperation, and immigration. So here, I don't want to suggest that prairie populism is always a bad thing, but populist movements and politics always pose risks to liberal democracies. For example, we've seen this trade war break out between Alberta and BC. We also know that populist sentiment can lead to a decline in trust in political elites and the weakening of political parties, which has been a primary contributing factor to democratic decline in other countries. We're also seeing troubling links between Western-based populism and larger white nationalist sentiment. So I don't think that these connections are necessarily clear, and I think they should be subject to kind of open empirical investigations, but there are worrying trends. For example, these days there's troubling links between emergent Western alienation and kind of anti-vaxxer sentiment. And I think that more research is needed into the connections between these moving forward. And finally, I think there's good reason to believe that Western alienation and Western-based populism is only going to get stronger. And this is in part due to the twin issues of climate change and the downturn in the oil and gas sector, especially in Alberta. To be sure, Alberta has been hit hard by this downturn. We've seen rising unemployment, job losses, a spike in the homeless population, opioid addiction, food bank use, and even rising suicide rates. And this is not to say that the severe impact of this downturn is the fault of a carbon tax or Trudeau, but there are indeed lessons to be learned in terms of recognizing the broader social and economic vulnerabilities generated by an over-reliance on the volatile oil and gas sector. So I guess maybe to conclude, I maybe would direct my questions. I'm wrapping up. Sorry, Victor, I see you in the chat. Towards the other panelists, who I will defer to 100% because I'm not an expert in Canadian constitutionalism, about kind of whether this is actually a threat to Canadian constitutionalism. When I was preparing for this roundtable, I went down this internet rabbit hole of recent interviews with Barry Cooper, who's one of these Calgary school guys. And he's been always an important voice on this issue, but his tone has definitely changed. He's not only critical of Ottawa, but other provincial conservative governments. And he's also a vocal advocate of holding a referendum on the need to amend Section 36 of the Constitution Act, which governs equalization payments. On the other hand, some on the left, and I think especially the left in Alberta, have argued in favor of a new strategy, one that would initiate major state-led capital investment in the regions that have been hit hardest by the downturn in oil and gas. But these investments, would be expressly made on the condition of leaving oil in the ground. So I think this is perhaps naive and underestimates the ways that both Western alienation, but also oil and gas, are deep-seated and embedded in the very political identities of Western Canadians. But yeah, I'll wrap up there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the torch over to Philippe.
Thanks very much, and thank you to the Lynn Center and the research group for inviting me to this event. It's really wonderful. I've enjoyed the morning sessions immensely. So again, thank you for including me. My opening remarks will focus on the question of the executive in Canadian constitutional thinking. And my reflections on this are part of two projects. The first is a new comparative study of executive power in Westminster states, which I'm examining through the prism of the royal prerogative. And the second is an ongoing project that's been running for a few years that attempts to define and outline the nature of and functions of the executive in Canada. And the most recent aspect of that work is an article that's coming out shortly on looking at a typology of executive authority in the Canadian Constitution. So to begin, as many of you know here, the executive is commonly labeled the most dangerous branch. Yet in a Canadian context, and indeed in many systems, it's the least understood branch. Studies of the Canadian Constitution, in fact, have shown very little interest in the executive as a branch of the state per se. The executive is studied in terms of administrative law or crown liability or employment law and so forth, but the executive itself remains poorly understood and largely ignored. Canadian constitutionalism or constitutional thinking remains focused on federalism and the division of powers, the constitutional amending formula, and of course, most significantly, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canadian political science has spent a little bit more time on the question, but this work has tended to examine particular offices and functions, such as those of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, central agencies, deputy ministers, and so forth, rather than the executive as a power of the state in the Constitution itself. And indeed, I would posit that the study of the executive in Canada is largely reductionist. The power is reduced to those who exercise authority, or particular authorities themselves, or the processes which we label the machinery of government. So just for instance, I ended on that term since Joseph Heath has a new book, The Machinery of Government, which draws on Canadian Westminsterism to produce a theory of the executive, but his theory of the executive is in terms of the bureaucracy and the administrative state, rather than the executive as a power of the state itself. So the executive power, its roles and spheres of competence are understood tacitly or as something that is there merely to be checked. Now, I would argue that the question of the executive has become more interesting since patriation as the Supreme Court has developed its separation of powers doctrine, and therefore it's led us to want or should want to better understand the contours. But we need a little bit of background here. So I think anybody who approaches Canada understands that the executive power is primordial, it's dominant, and yet precisely because of that, it's largely ignored in our understanding of the separation of powers. The executive, through the prism of the Crown, established the political entity we now call Canada by conquest and by proclamation. The evolution towards responsible government in Canada was more about determining who wielded executive power than it was about empowering the legislature. Following the 1867 constitutional settlement, constitutional debates then shifted to the federal question, to powers of legislation, the linguistic questions, and ultimately questions of Canadian sovereignty within first the British Empire and later the Commonwealth of Nations. And whereas the 1982 constitutional settlement addressed the sovereignty question and it expanded our constitutional lens to include fundamental rights and the amending procedure, the executive itself remains a marginal question. We see this in particular in the development of the separation of powers doctrine by the Supreme Court again in the aftermath of patriation. Canada's separation of powers doctrine, as it's been articulated by the courts, focuses largely on defining the boundaries of the legislative powers vis-a-vis the judiciary, or the legislative powers vis-a-vis the Constitution. And it draws on the codified Constitution to some extent, and of course, the historical legacy of British constitutionalism. So Canada's Constitution Act 1867 provides us a bit of a roadmap here insofar as it does distinguish between the powers of the state and their authorities, and the preambular provision guides us to having fundamental, or has been used by the Supreme Court, I should say, to articulate a uniquely Canadian separation of powers doctrine, largely, for example, drawing on parliamentary privilege, as understood in the UK, to define the boundaries of the legislative power and its unique functions, and similarly drawing on the Act of Settlement of 1701 to define judicial independence. So we see, for instance, in the legislature, its boundaries and how its independence and how its contours are defined are in cases such as New Brunswick Broadcasting or Invade, or more recently in Mikisew. But the status of the executive is left unclear. And from the standpoint of political constitutionalism, again, this is understandable. As I said, the executive is primordial in Canada, and it's dominant over the legislature. So it's consistently active, and it's the constant branch of the Canadian state. It's always there, and it's always acting, and it's always operating in the background without us having to spend or even really consider much attention to what it's doing. And given its control over the legislative process, there's no real question of having to debate whether or not the executive has boundaries that it must protect from the legislature. Because since it dominates the legislature, there's never any question of the legislature encroaching upon its authorities or its particular powers. Where the separation of powers question with respect to the executive has been more acute is in the area of judicial review. So here we do have questions that have arisen notably around charter and review for constitutionality in other areas. But our understanding of the separation of powers here, or of the executive here, is largely cast in terms of what is justiciable and what are political questions. So it's more about what the courts will not review as opposed to what belongs to the executive as an authority of the state properly. Now, there are exceptions here. And I think Cadder is probably the case in point. And here we have allusions to something in Canadian constitutional thinking which is not well articulated. So the Supreme Court in Cadder tells us that the executive has constitutional responsibility to make decisions on matters of foreign affairs in the context of complex and ever-changing circumstances, taking into account Canada's broader national interests. The court also tells us that judicial review of the exercise of the prerogative power for constitutionality remains sensitive to the fact that the executive branch of government is responsible for decisions under this power, and that the executive is better placed to make such decisions within a range of constitutional options. Now, how can we have this discussion of being sensitive to the unique areas of the executive without ever really thinking them through, without ever really defining them? I would argue, drawing on Michael Foley's work, that basically executive power in Canada is an abeyance. So as Foley defined them, constitutional abeyances are a set of implicit agreements to collude in keeping fundamental questions of political authority in a state of irresolution. He continues that abeyances represent a way of accommodating the absence of a definitive constitutional settlement and of providing the means of adjusting to the issues left unresolved in the fabric of the Constitution. The question then arises, why do we have this abeyance? What I would argue is that we are stuck, effectively, between two constitutional interpretations. We are stuck between where the Constitution Act and the separation of powers doctrine seems to be heading, and the historic legacy of British constitutionalism that we still refer to when attempting to understand the powers of the state. So, how do these two interact? The executive power is clearly identified in the Constitution Act 1867. Part 3, and sections 9 and 15 in particular, suggests that there are core constitutional executive powers and functions, as does the ruling in Cadder that I just mentioned. Yet the historical British tradition is such that the legislature must be supreme over the executive. No executive power is protected from parliamentary statute. We are, as it were, caught between two constitutional understandings. So to understand these two understandings and where Canada might go, I think it's useful to contrast the United Kingdom and Australia on this point. So in the United Kingdom, there is no question that the executive is subservient to Parliament. Parliamentary sovereignty is a cardinal constitutional principle in the British system. And even we see this now, and I think this goes a little bit to Professor Gordon's discussion of ideology in all these questions. Both sides of the ideological divide in the United Kingdom glom on to parliamentary sovereignty, in part because if you look at it in terms of the Brexit debate, for instance, if you want to leave Brexit, then parliamentary sovereignty is supreme. If you want to prevent the UK from leaving the European Union, you emphasize parliamentary sovereignty over a popular referendum, for instance. So it really does anchor the British debate quite significantly. We see a different trend in Australia. Here, the codified executive power, as we have in Canada, has led the courts to move beyond the historic British understanding of the Crown and Parliament to a doctrine of inherent executive competencies, notably around what they labeled the nationhood power. So this is effectively a Lockean understanding of the executive, whereas we have retained a Blackstonian or a Diceian one, to put it in terms that I think most people here are familiar with. So Australia's Westminster approach, which brings federalism, duly elected bicameralism, and so forth, has moved beyond the British understanding to actually have a vouchsafed, protected, understood, contoured notion of the executive. Canadian constitutional interpretation remains stuck in the gap between these two interpretations. On the one hand, the executive is understood to be subservient to the legislature and subject to judicial review. On the other hand, there's a recognition of inherent executive powers and responsibilities. Now, the question of whether there are any powers or responsibilities that the legislature could not displace or modify is one that we, again, never need to confront because we simply, in good Canadian practice, don't think the issue will ever come up. Dominance and deference, therefore, have discouraged us from thinking about the executive in the Canadian separation of powers. And drawing on, again, fully, we can say that this abeyance is actually a sign of constitutional maturity, that we've just managed this ambiguity, and it's a sign of our success. Nevertheless, it leaves us with deliberate silence about the principal governing power of the state. So, to conclude, who cares? Why does this matter? The question I often get from my peer reviews. Who cares? In the first instance, I'd argue that we can't have a complete understanding of the separation of powers in Canada if we only focus on the judicial and the legislative. There is a third power, and if we want to understand the separation, we need to appreciate the contours of each power. Second, as the earlier panels today have discussed, such as Professor Dawood's observations about the effectiveness of government, or Professor Watkins' discussion of imperium, or the question of constitutions as both power-limiting and power-enabling mechanisms. The executive is ever present in our debates about the Constitution and indeed in our lives, but it's under-theorized. We don't know much about it. Finally, just to state the obvious, the pandemic has highlighted the centrality of the executive in emergencies and exceptional circumstances. Now, while there's been some effort to ensure that legislatures remain involved, our current crisis is one in which the executive and its powers have become highly salient. Nonetheless, interestingly, the Canadian debate has remained focused on its preferred topics, federalism. So which Canadian executive should act? Or on the role of particular office holders, such as what is the relationship between cabinet and public health officers, and rights. So what can the executive do in various situations under its powers within the constructs of the Charter? But here, the executive is hiding in plain sight, and yet we are still talking about it through our traditional lenses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Manfredi.
Thanks very much, Victor, and thanks, Jacob, and to RGCS for inviting me to be a part of this. It's nice to get my nose out of reading the Règles budgétaires of the Ministère de l'Éducation supérieure for a few minutes. I feel a little bit inadequate after hearing my two colleagues' presentations because I'm afraid mine are not nearly so well developed as theirs. And I also feel after listening to Professor Gordon's presentation, it brought back a lot of memories. I feel a little bit like I'm here as the ghost of politics past. So, but I appreciate that, and I'd be happy to, since I was there at some of the things that she's talking about, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that if people are interested. The subtitle of this is about prospects and challenges of Canadian constitutionalism. So I decided to focus a little bit on area of Canadian constitutionalism with which I have the most knowledge, and that is around the form of constitutional amendment that I've called micro-constitutional amendment that takes place through constitutional litigation, largely through rights-based litigation, and a little bit about the relationship between that kind of constitutional politics and the macro-constitutional politics of formal constitutional amendment. So I tried to identify what I called 3 prospects and 3 challenges, and hopefully I can use up 15 minutes talking about those, maybe less. A couple of them I want to speak about in a little bit more detail than the others. The first prospect, of course, and I think it's referred to a little bit in Professor Gordon's talk, is that since the 1990s, Canada has, of course, been unable to engage in large-scale macro-constitutional reform, and I think that will continue, despite the desire of some actors to engage in some fundamental amendment to the Canadian Constitution, however defined at the macro level through the formal amendment process. That is, I think, likely to continue to be impossible for a lot of different reasons. The only formal constitutional amendments I think that will be successful are those that only require the agreement of two actors, such as the ones that transformed the school systems in Newfoundland and Quebec much earlier. So I think I don't think we have a prospect of any kind of successful large-scale formal constitutional reform project. If I were advising any politician about that, I'd tell them just to take that off the table. It's not going to happen, and they shouldn't be worried about it or engaged in it. A second prospect is one that I think is a little bit of the Supreme Court's own making, and is, I think, going to frustrate some of the ambitions, at least of the current government, and that is because of the Supreme Court's decision and the Supreme Court Act reference that emerged out of the appointment of Richard Nadeau to the Supreme Court. Structural reform to the judicial appointments process is, I think, going to be extremely difficult. Of course, the issue that's on the table now is requiring that Supreme Court justices be bilingual. Certainly, the Prime Minister, in making those appointments, can ensure that candidates who come forward must be bilingual, but the idea that that could be somehow enshrined in legislation, I think, if the Supreme Court is going to act consistently with its decisions in the Supreme Court Act reference, is going to be impossible. And I think this is important because, of course, we have two vacancies coming up on the court, both from Ontario in the next couple of years. Justice Abella is due for retirement this year, and Justice Moldaver next year. So the opportunities are going to be there for the current government, but they're going to have to do it without, I think, enshrining that kind of an obligation into legislation and being able to bind future governments on it. The third prospect, I think, is actually an interesting one, and from my point of view, an exciting one. And we saw it last week in the decision around Bill 21 that came out of Quebec. We saw it about 2 years ago, the Peace and Policy Options by Gregoire Weber, Robert Leckie, and there's a third author whose name escapes me at the moment around the Notwithstanding Clause. And I think we're going to see, and I think this is a good prospect, a reemergence of a serious discussion around the Notwithstanding Clause and the constitutional theory that might underpin it. As I've been around long enough that I was for the Notwithstanding Clause before there was a Notwithstanding Clause, so my views on this are pretty clear. I think the Notwithstanding Clause is actually an important part of the constitutional order, particularly in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It has, however, been, for most of the Charter's history, been treated as an aberration. And I think that's the result of an historical accident and a series of conceptual errors that I'd be happy to elaborate on. But I think particularly the points that that are made in that policy options piece around what the real meaning of the Notwithstanding Clause is, the notion that it applies to the operation of statutes and that it does not foreclose judicial review, I think is a very interesting notion. I think it addresses an issue with the Notwithstanding Clause that I think has always been a structural flaw of the clause, and one that governments that have used it have exploited, which is my own view is that the Notwithstanding Clause should not be used to preempt judicial review. And of course, there's nothing in the text of the clause that prevents its use to preempt judicial review. The point that Weber and Leckie and their colleague make is that, in fact, the text of the Notwithstanding Clause means that it can't be used to preempt judicial review, in the sense that all it does is indicate that legislation will operate notwithstanding the sections 2 and 7 through 15 of the Charter, but it does not prohibit courts from exercising judicial review in the first instance and issuing a declaration that a law is nevertheless in violation of a Charter provision. I think that's an interesting idea. I think it addresses a little bit this preemptive notion of judicial review. I still worry about it because it strikes me as that it's still it still defers to the notion of a judicial monopoly on constitutional interpretation, and it does give the advantage to the Supreme Court in a proper dialogue between courts and legislatures on the meaning of rights, not the false dialogue that Professors Hogg and Bushell talk about. I'd prefer to see a change to the text that would simply say that a law shall operate notwithstanding a final judicial decision that a law violates sections 2 or sections 7 through 15 of the Charter. But based on my first proposition that formal constitutional amendment is impossible, that's not going to happen. But I think that's the way we have to think about the Notwithstanding Clause. So let me turn to challenges now, and I have 3. I won't spend very much time on the first one because I think Professor Gordon laid out, and to some degree Professor Lagassé. Obviously, I think there's going to be a bit of a resurgence of the old Constitution here. That I think there's going to be a lot more action around fiscal federalism and interprovincial trade. We've seen the Como case decided recently, or in the last few years. Kelly mentioned the Alberta-BC trade war. So one of the challenges, I think, to Canadian constitutionalism and around the carbon tax, other aspects of fiscal federalism, the recently announced budgetary provisions around childcare and so on. So I think there's going to be a lot more constitutional discussion and constitutional action around these two, what I would almost call traditional pillars of Canadian constitutionalism, fiscal federalism, and interprovincial trade. I think we still face a challenge in that there is still this notion, this apolitical myth of the Supreme Court of Canada. Maybe no one in this room subscribes to that myth, or this virtual room subscribes to that myth, but I would certainly say that that is the predominant conventional understanding of the court, that it is apolitical. And by when I say that it's a political court, I don't mean it's necessarily a partisan court, but what I mean is that the decisions of the court are driven by the collective understanding of the justices of what constitutes a good society. That their decisions on charter issues in particular is all driven by what they think a good social and political order should look like. They of course have differing points of view on that, but nevertheless, the court is a policy-making institution. it decides issues, I think, on the same basis as any other political institution. And I think we still have this myth that it doesn't do that. Of course, it's in the court's own self-interest to perpetuate that myth. But I still think it's going to be a challenge to continue to attack that myth. The final challenge I'll mention is one that is what I was working on before I took up this position, and I should mention I'm speaking here, of course, in my capacity as a professor of political science and not as my capacity as provost, lest anything I say be understood as an official position of the university. I know you wouldn't take that, but I'll just add that disclaimer as I can. What I was working on is I think the relationship between conservatism. Kelly, invoked my name in that area, so I'll embrace the label. Conservatism and judicial review under a constitutionally entrenched bill or charter of rights. I think this is something that has been under theorized and I think needs to be understood. There's a need to develop what I would call a conservative theory of rights-based judicial review in Canada. I think it may exist elsewhere. That's partly the result, the absence of that kind of theory is partly a result of the initial conservative, I would say traditional conservative reaction to the charter, which was that it was an affront to parliamentary supremacy, so that conservatism in that sense. And then, of course, the later post-charter conservative approach, which I suppose could best be summarized is the charter is a terrible document and the judges who interpret it are evil people. Maybe that's the Calgary School approach, Kelly. That's out there. But I think there's something that has always struck me as to be two strange things, because in principle, to the extent that conservatism is a theory about limited government, in principle, judicial review, especially rights-based judicial review, should be a friend of conservatism, because rights-based judicial review is about imposing limits on government. And of course, we've seen the emergence of conservative litigation organizations, the Canadian Constitutional Foundation and the Justice Committee for Constitutional Freedoms. Interesting that both of those have CCF in their titles, which is a completely different historical meaning in Canadian politics. We've seen that, I think, the emergence of the Runnymede Society, which I think could be broadly understood as more conservative. I think that I think we have more ideological heterogeneity on the Canadian bench now than we did. Not so much on the Supreme Court. Justice Brown, of course, stands out, but and in the lower courts, people like Justices Grant Huscroft and others are I think offering a different perspective on these things. So I think there's an opportunity to think through what a conservative theory of charter-based judicial review might look like. And I'll conclude and say that I think the secret to that theory lies in embracing Beverly McLaughlin's inherent libertarianism. And so I think conservatives should be looking to Justice McLaughlin. And my own sense is that the fact that she's been embraced by Canadian progressives, I think, but I think largely because she got into a fight with Stephen Harper. But I would argue that her fight with Stephen Harper is because Stephen Harper was not sufficiently libertarian for her. And I'll end on that.
Thank you very much. I think we're doing well for time, so it gives us an opportunity to have a bit of discussion among the presenters, and just to perhaps seed the field a bit. There seem to be two kinds of questions, or two ways of approaching the problems, the prospects and challenges of Canadian constitutionalism. One of them has to do with particular issues that might come up, that is certain points of contention that are substantive points of contention. And another has to do with the agents who will have to deal with whatever points of contention come up. So perhaps a more structural question. So maybe thinking along those two lines, if any of you would like to respond to the others and have a bit of a conversation for the next 15, 20 minutes or so.
I can maybe start. I mean, it's just to link up my concerns with Professor Gordon's. I think the one of the things that is underappreciated, and it's evident on the surface, but we don't speak about it maybe as openly as we should, is that there is an intimate connection between populism and executive power. The executive and populism are allies much in the same way that legislatures are often allied with the liberal side of things along with the judiciary. And if you do see the underlying connection there between attempting to have a government that's able to more directly respond to what the people wish, right, is an interesting way of interpreting the executive that tends to dominate conservative thought in Canada. It's moved away from the traditional British thinking of it and is much more in line with an American variant. Which is quite interesting in the development of Canadian conservatism as well. And just to draw another issue, I think I fully agree with Professor Manfredi that what we're seeing in Canada to some degree and a prospect that we have going forward is the revenge of the 1867 Constitution. We've had a good 20 or 40 years now of the Charter being the central constitutional question. And the 1867 Constitution is now starting to roar back quite significantly. And it's here again, it's an understudied part of our constitutional framework when you compare it with the Charter. Leaving aside the division of powers question, some of these fundamental questions are 1867 questions as opposed to 1992 questions. And they are coming to the fore again after having a bit of an abeyance there again in the aftermath of the amending formula failures. Over.
So we have a few questions. If Professor Gordon and Professor Manfredi
well, I'd be happy to hear from the from what other questions other people have. So rather.
Great. So the first person I have in the queue is Jeffrey Sigalet.
Hi. Well, thanks for that awesome set of presentations. I have a question for Professor Lagassé and for Professor Manfredi. So my question for Professor Lagassé is whether or not you think that the discussion of Henry VIII clauses in the recent carbon tax reference, which are Henry VIII clauses are what they sound like. They're apparently statutory clauses that allow the executive to basically change the law at its whim. And in a really surprising part of the carbon tax reference, Justice Cote, in her dissent, she argued that Henry VIII clauses were one reason were unconstitutional and foreign to Canada's understanding of parliamentary supremacy. And I was really surprised to see that, not only because it just seems odd to me to say that Henry VIII clauses are foreign to our Westminster tradition because they're a regular part of Westminster constitutional law in the United Kingdom. This Henry VIII clause, even in the Human Rights Act 1998 that we were talking about earlier today, Professor Fox-Desson was talking about earlier. So I was surprising, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on that part of her dissent, and whether or not you think that her concept, so her idea was that you can't, the Parliament can't hive out this power for the executive to arbitrarily change the law this way, because that violates the supremacy of Parliament. And in a way that sort of fits more with the Australian idea that you're talking about, that there's a concept of what the prerogative powers of the executive are, and there's a concept, and then everything else is parliamentary, and Parliament in a way that goes with in a way it goes against the Australian idea that there may be a constitutionalized set of executive powers that can't be delegated or whatnot by a Henry VIII clause, right? And I just wondered what you thought about that, and which way you think, what paradigm that fits in, and if you think that might get picked up sometime, or is it just going to contribute to the sort of will people start taking that up and put it one direction or the other, or sort of just become dicta that never gets taken up ever? And my question for Professor Manfredi is about your. I can't help but ask this about your view about how the Section 33 litigation in Quebec will actually go. Do you think then that, so the hack decision of the Quebec Superior Court just came out last week, and I'm wondering, in that decision, the Superior Court refused to, it sort of said that the idea that Professor Weber and Dean Leckie and Eric Mendelsohn put out there, that there could be declarations about notwithstanding clause statutes consistency with the charter, or inconsistencies with the charter. It's the hack decision said that's sort of a no-go zone for us because it's a hypothetical kind of question. And to my shame, I've already read the decision, and I think that in my view, they say that, but then they say a lot of things that sound contrary to that. Like, before they get into why there can't be declarations, they sort of talk in this how would we do it if we did it way about what limits there could be if precedent and their view of the hypothetical nature of those declarations didn't get the way, how they could potentially set limits on different aspects of uses of Section 33. And I was wondering, so I just was wondering where you think that's actually going to go. Is that going to get picked up by the Court of Appeal? And will they side with the lower court? And to what extent will this potentially get to the Supreme Court? And where may they potentially overturn or decide differently, or amend the holding in Ford that there's only requirements of form about Section 33? Or will they potentially say that there can be declarations about Section 33 decisions? Just what's the bottom line? What do you think? What is your prediction if you look in the crystal ball?
Either one can.
Well, I guess the question directed to me is a little bit shorter than the one directed to Philip, so I can take care of mine. I mean, my short answer is I don't know. You're right. The standing position of the Supreme Court of Canada from Ford is that it's simply a form. Section 33 simply imposes formal constraints on the use of Section 33. I wish I had been following the current court closely enough to try to predict how they might approach that particular precedent. But my own sense is that I would try to approach the question like this. The court is always interested in protecting its institutional position and not doing something that would provoke a legislative reaction that would threaten its position as an interpreter of the Constitution, or as an arbiter of good public policy, which is why, to some degree, the threat of the use of Section 33, I think, has despite the fact that it doesn't get used very often, has nevertheless acted as a constraint on the court going too far in certain circumstances. So I actually don't think the court wants to lose that possibility. So if I were to bet, I would bet that they would not reverse what they said in Ford.
Thanks very much for the question. I really appreciate it because it touches on precisely why I think this is important work to do in a Canadian context. So we have a tendency in Canada to not really understand the full contours of executive authority. And your question about Henry VIII clause is a very good one. And it's part of a pattern in the Canadian context where we take things of the Westminster countries that still operate in the constitutional monarchical construct under the common law. We tend to be the more executive power centric of them. And Henry VIII clause is a good one. So to say that it's outside of the Canadian constitutional tradition is incorrect. If you go back to 1918, the Gray case, here the Supreme Court of Canada considered whether or not the executive could use order in council authority granted to it by Parliament to amend or expand what was compulsory service in World War. And ultimately, Mr. Gray, who contested that he was not originally subject to this, and then Cabinet expanded the criteria, brought this, and ultimately was determined that this Henry VIII clause was certainly in keeping with Canadian law, and the court held that there was no difference between statute and common law when it came to this. So Henry VIII clauses definitely are part of the Canadian constitutional tradition, and they tend to be uncontroversial. And I'll just link this up to another kind of piece of this, which is another controversial one. You mentioned Australia, where at common law in the British tradition, the executive can act as a person because it's personified by the crown. So this is something that's referred to as the Ram doctrine. So the crown has all the powers of a person at common law. Now, as we saw in the recent Australian cases of Williams 1 and 2, the Australian courts very much limited this notion that the executive can just act as a person at common law, particularly when it came to spending. In the UK, this has been fairly controversial as well, because it seems to give the executive a significant amount of authority that Parliament never granted it, or that just the common law provides as a person. In the Canadian context, we have no problem with this. We refer to it routinely. It's just kind of par for the course, just the way government does business here. And it doesn't seem to raise any questions. It's really quite fascinating. I mean, and here again, when we raise questions about how is this part of our Canadian constitutional understanding, because we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what is the nature of the executive power, we don't really get into good, even judicial rulings about this, precisely because it's under-theorized and understood. Over.
Great. So the next person, Roberto Gargarella.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No, it's a question for all, but particularly for Professor Manfredi. As a foreigner interested in constitution and dialogue, I have been always, paying attention to the Notwithstanding Clause, and I read some of your stuff on the matter, but it's surprising for me, after 40 years, that to see that there are so many controversies about how it works and how it should work. So I would like to hear a little bit more from you, Professor Manfredi in particular, about how it's working, and in particular, in connection with dialogue. I also share a broader and more ambitious understanding of constitutional dialogue, and I see, the Notwithstanding initiative as a modest step in the direction of a more dialogic constitutionalism. But even in those modest terms, what would you say? It has been contributing to a more dialogic understanding of the law.
I would say that it has the potential to do that. And so to go back to your first, why has the Notwithstanding Clause been controversial for 40 years? I talked about an historical accident and 3 conceptual errors. I think the historical accident is that we had a use of the Notwithstanding Clause that angered people before we had a Supreme Court of Canada charter decision that angered people. So the first use of the Notwithstanding Clause was following the Quebec sign cases, and that was seen as an improper use of the Notwithstanding Clause, and I think that colored how people viewed the Notwithstanding Clause. I think I argued in my very first book that had we had say the Seaboyer decision striking down the rape shield laws, if the Notwithstanding Clause had been used after that decision, people's views about the Notwithstanding Clause might have been different. So this historical accident that the clause followed a judgment that most people thought was bad, I think I won't go into all the conceptual, all 3 conceptual errors, but I think the biggest one, and I think it speaks to the point you raise, is that I think if you're going to have true dialogue, what I call true dialogue, you have to accept the notion of coordinate construction. You have to accept the idea that both the legislature or executive and the courts have a coordinate responsibility and legitimacy of determining what the Constitution means. That seems to me to be the only way you can have real dialogue. And the problem with the dialogue theory is it emerged from Hogg and Bushel and was developed after that, is of course they don't embrace that idea. They still embrace the notion of a judicial monopoly. So that's what, and so in that context, the Notwithstanding Clause as a foundation of coordinate construction becomes a foundation of dialogue. But if you don't believe in coordinate construction and you think that the courts have a monopoly over what the Constitution means, then of course the Notwithstanding Clause will look like an aberration. And I think that's where we've been for 40 years.
Professor Gordon, did you want to jump in here? No, okay. So I'll keep to the queue. Professor Abizadeh.
Yes, I have well, since Professor Muñiz-Fraticelli has put us on the professor front, I have a question for Professor Gordon. And my question is about, so you were giving us a narrative about Western alienation as on the rise. And I guess I want to ask you what the evidence for that is. I'm sort of like, you know, I'm old enough to remember the the CF-18 crisis in Manitoba when the contract went to Quebec, and you know it was a betrayal because it was actually a Conservative party that was in power, and everybody was aghast that even the Conservatives are going to forget about the West when it push comes to shove. And so and of course that that was sort of the precipitator to the Reform Party and so on and so forth. So I guess where's the evidence that this is on the rise? Isn't it just being part of the landscape with ebbs and flows, but hasn't it been part of the landscape for at least as far as my memory goes back? And are the things that you're noticing right now just an artifact of the fact that there's a liberal government in power at the moment, as opposed to when Stephen Harper was in power? Where's the rise in sentiment? What's the evidence for that?
Like, honestly, I would agree with you. I mean, this isn't something that's distinctly new. I memean, maybe just like for the narrative punch, I was like, oh yes, it's like on the rise. And maybe it's because like I can't remember those days. So but no, I certainly agree with you. And I mean, like there's a lot of overlap between the scandals that we see around the Liberal government, particularly in Quebec, like, SNC Lavalin, and like feelings out West. But I do think I do think one difference is, if you believe the polling, it's on the rise and it's at sort of an all-time high, but you don't have to believe the polling. But I also think it's manifesting new forms of like political formation. And I think that the general feeling, like, we don't know what will happen in the next election, but my prediction is the Liberal Party will win. Maybe it's like too soon to see that, because I think that there's a lot of disillusionment with the Federal Conservative Party, with Aaron O'Toole, who's like basically endorsed a carbon tax under a different name. And so I think maybe one of the shifts that we're seeing is like, particularly at the level of partisan politics, is like this kind of West wanting out as opposed to West wanting in. And I think like also what we're seeing is like interesting trends and forms of populism in other places. So yeah, I'm not here to suggest this is something that's like brand new, and I basically agree with your kind of diagnosis of it. It's something that ebbs and flows. What was interesting is that at West, there was also some disillusionment with the Harper government by the end of his kind of tenure as prime minister as well. I agree.
I don't know exactly when things shifted to professor as opposed to first name, but in the spirit of keeping to a titular abeyance as a
my question follows awkwardly from Arash's, because it's also directed at Professor Gordon, also known as Kelly. But it's sort of premised on what Kelly said about Western alienation being true. So let's just hypothesize for a moment that it's actually stably true, as opposed to just a kind of an artifact of contingent political events. So I have a theory of why the Quebec sovereignist sentiment has fallen which is in no way original. I think it's shared by a lot of people, which is that Quebec sovereignty has been a victim of Quebec state building. Basically, Quebec nationalism has killed Quebec sovereignty because successive governments, be they Liberal, PQ, have essentially taken up all the constitutional space that has been made available to them, and then some probably, and basically made Canada kind of irrelevant to Quebecers for a wide range of things. You could live in Quebec, as you know. I mean, I don't know whether it's something that struck you having moved from Alberta to Quebec, but by and large, what happens to you on a day-to-day basis is a function of the Quebec state and its big projects. But the sense that there is a state here, I think, is quite strong. And that's because at a certain point, maybe around the time of the Constitution, Quebecers kind of collectively came to the conclusion that there was no way of arriving at a kind of narrative of Canada that would be unified, right? And that our attitude to the rest of Canada would become kind of Belgian, sort of cold peace, right? We have these shared institutions, but we don't infuse them with any particular meaning. That doesn't mean that they're unstable. That doesn't mean that we want to reject them. On the contrary, maybe because we don't expect much from them except this kind of functional, utility. It might make it in a way more robust because we don't end up in the situation of sort of like jilted lovers who expected so much more from their partner. So I guess my question is, so this is where the assumption that you made needs to be true in order for this question to make sense. Might it be a good thing in the long run for Canada if Western alienation were to really be alienation? In other words, wanting out rather than wanting in, because what it might lead to is a sort of process in. So which provinces? Alberta, certainly, I don't know to what degree Saskatchewan and Manitoba would be part of this project, or maybe to be a regional thing, sort of start doing a kind of a Quebec thing and developing their own institutions, their own big projects within the bounds of what the Constitution allows, and sort of reach this kind of more Belgian moment with the rest of Canada. So that was a long-winded way of, it was too long-winded. But anyway, hopefully I saw you nodding a little bit. So
I feel like you answered your own question.
I know. I think what do you think about my answer to my own question?
No, I think that. So I think that like this history of sort of like economic alienation takes on different contours in the West, right? So, and like I'm from Western Canada. I guess like to Arash's point of like why I feel like this is rising is because like I'm from Alberta. I spend a lot of time there, and like I feel like it's rising. But I think like the forms of alienation, it's not about state building. It's almost like this, like we have been an economic contributor. We're sort of misunderstood by the Canadian state, by Central Canada. And I think interestingly, and I mean, obviously because of the, these mega constitutional debates that happened in the 90s, a lot of Western alienation is actually positioned against Quebec, right? And that Quebec has taken up so much space, and so there's not enough for Alberta. So like, do I think that it could be kind of a productive thing to develop some kind of like cohesive regional identity and institutions? I think that that's like an optimistic reading of it. And certainly, there are productive forces that come from these types of populist movements. Like I think we saw in the 90s about sort of discussions about Senate reform and electoral reform. But I don't know that Western alienation is that like cohesive or like rational, or like it doesn't circulate around a state building project like in the Quebec context. I don't know if that kind of answers the question.
Before I go on to the next,
I would be really curious to hear Professor Manfredi's views on this. And he also told us that he would tell us some stories, so I'm in for that as well.
There's been a lot of stuff on Twitter about faculty lounges. So, I was around the faculty lounge at the University of Calgary from 1977 to 1983. So, I guess that was the birthing of the Calgary School. So Reiner Knopf was already there when I started my undergraduate degree. Barry Cooper came, I think, in 1980 maybe. And then Ted Morton came in 1981, was only there for a year before he went to run his father's gubernatorial campaign in Wyoming, and then came back because his father lost. No, I think this, going back to Rash's, I think this alienation, actually, I think you can trace it back to 1973, 1974, which was the oil crisis and the fights between Alberta and the federal government around royalties. I mean, I'm old enough, and Calgary was a place in those days when we actually watched remember those TVs used to bring into classrooms in the 1970s? We actually watched the federal provincial conferences around oil royalties, and I think that the alienation actually goes back to there, and certainly it goes back even further. But that's my first kind of memory of it, and it did, as Kelly said, it really came to the forefront even more during the National Energy Program. I graduated from my undergraduate degree in 1981, which was probably the height or the depth of the National Energy Program, depending on your point of view. I think the reason why it may look like it's increased in the last few years is that, of course, for 10 years, the people who felt alienated were running the Canadian government. So it was at least ebbing during that period. So they kind of won. That notion, as Kelly said, very different. The Reform Party's mantra was the West wants in. They got in. They got the government. They got the government of Canada. And I think the difference between the populism now is that it's much less about wanting in, because it's much more about going back to a new version of the firewall that Barry and Reiner and Ted and Ken Bosenkool all wrote about. So it's about that. On the question, Daniel, of a Quebec state, like Kelly, I also moved, although I'd spent some time in California before moving to Montreal. My last Canadian home was Alberta, and it is different to see the role of the Quebec state in your life compared to, say, the role of the Alberta state in your life. It's a different kind of thing. I mean, even by the time I was there, Kelly probably knows this more. I mean, you didn't get your driver's license from the SAAQ. You went to a private franchisee who was in charge of that. So the state wasn't there, and certainly there's no the Alberta Liquor Control Board disappeared 15 years ago. So it is a different approach, and it is a different. The state is heavier here, and you sense it even more.
And which maybe speaks to another kind of dimension of this, is Alberta is the heart of conservatism, and certainly kind of post Calgary School, like a Hayekian sort of conservatism. And so I, having sort of recently moved here, I'm always struck by the trust that there is in the state here, and sort of high levels of compliance, which might be a barrier to the kind of project that you're kind of talking about, Daniel.
But I will say that one thing that I noticed when I moved, that we're not talking about cultural differences, constitutional differences, but I think these cultural differences do have constitutional consequences. I found Quebec a much more segmented society than Alberta. And when I moved here, the question people would ask you is, who are you? They wanted to segment you into what ethno-cultural linguistic group you belong to. In Alberta, the question was always, what do you do? It was always about, it was not about who you were, it was what you did. And I found that, I confess, I found the Alberta question better than the Quebec question, but that's a difference I noticed.
That's interesting. I wanted to call attention to something before I moved on to the next question, is that one of the benefits of this format is that it allows us to share resources and information very quickly and efficiently through the chat box. So I want to remind everyone that there is a chat. Professor Lagassé has already shared an article on the Henry VIII clauses, and there's also comments that I suppose stand in for the kind of two-finger brief intervention that we would usually get in other conferences. So there's two more people on the queue. I'll call on Dwight Newman now.
Good afternoon. My question is to Professor Manfredi, and I was particularly intrigued by your comments about the room and need for there to be the development of more conservative theory on judicial rights review. And I thought that that's something where there's a lot of interesting potential, just as an intellectually interesting project. Theory in terms of understanding well what comes from the courts in the coming years. Absent a massive court packing in the United States, there's going to be some different jurisprudence coming out in the United States, presumably. And you've mentioned the increased heterogeneity of the Canadian courts. And so my question is actually about how law and political science departments equip themselves well to engage in that kind of project in a sophisticated way, particularly when there have been reports about a lot of resistance to the hiring of conservative-leaning academics. And I put this question obviously as an academic question too, not in any connection with any view related to university matters, but just as an academic matter, how do university departments equip themselves well to engage in these important discussions, and if you have any reflections on that?
Well, I would say that one thing that has to happen, I won't talk about hiring particular types of people. I would say one thing that has to happen, it's happened more frequently than it did early in my career, is that the political science departments and the faculties of law have to actually talk to each other. You know, I would say, I mean, I think when I became a dean and started working with Nick Kassir, and we decided to do more between the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Law, that was partly driven by my experience in that. So by the time I became dean, it was 2006. I've been at McGill for 27 years. I'd never once been invited to give a talk at the Faculty of Law. And I think that experience was not uncommon in Canadian universities, at least through the late 80s and through the 90s, that there was just not a sense in which either discipline thought it could learn from the other. And maybe it's because I'm a political scientist. I think the bias was more pronounced on the law side, but that's maybe my own prejudice.
The recording will stop at 3:30, but before I go to the last question, I wanted to invite the speakers, if they can, to linger in the virtual room for a few minutes after the recording stops, in case anyone else wants to ask a question or have a more informal exchange. So on that note, Professor Jacob Levy.
First, I want to note that the challenge of getting law and political science to talk with each other has been, meeting that challenge has been one of the goals of RGCS all along, and Chris Manfredi, in his capacity then as dean, helped move things in the direction that eventually became RGCS and getting some of the kinds of conversations that we're seeing here going between people in law and political science here. This is a question, I think, both for Kelly and for Philipe. And unlike everyone who's giving their tales of autobiographical knowledge, it is born of significant autobiographical ignorance. I was trying to count, almost certainly less than 14 days in Canada west of Toronto. And most of that has been taken up by meetings of the CPSA in and out. I know very little about the West in any deep understanding way. But it's a question about whether and how we should think of Western conservatism in Canada as populist? And if it is it populist in the ways that we've come to think of populism as posing a challenge to constitutional democracy or the rule of law? I'm primed to worry about populists coming to power, in particular populists coming to power in systems where the separation of powers is potentially vulnerable, situations where executive power can be significantly exploited. That is a lesson that I think we've learned from looking at the fragility of constitutional democracy around the world in recent years. For all of the things that I will complain about with respect to the Harper government, I don't perceive that as having been a period of time when there was the kind of populist challenge to the rule of law, to the separation of powers, to stable constitutional procedures that we've seen in a lot of other countries. So far as I know, Western conservative provincial governments, is there more to the characterization of Western conservatism as populist than affect and style? Is there something that maps onto the way political scientists talk about populism and populist movements elsewhere? And if it's the case that there's genuine populism, how has it, but if it has, how has it resisted this tendency of populism to drift into undermining the separation of powers, politicization and corruption of the executive, undermining of the legislature and the judiciary that we've seen in so many other populist governments and populist movements around the world?
Who wants to take it?
Go ahead, Philippe.
Thanks. Sure. Well, what I'd say is the populism, you do see it from a constitutional point of view, but it's not populism as we would see it in other types of jurisdictions, notably in constitutional republics where sovereignty resides with the people, and that makes, I think, a huge difference in the Canadian construct. So I'm going to put my crown hat on here, or I should say I'll put the crown on. From a crown perspective, obviously, when you go back to the roots of Canadian populism, both left and right confronted the crown as one of their major impediments in the past. So why do we not have binding referenda in Canada? It's because you are unable to have a popular vote that's not connected to the legislature impose royal assent upon the lieutenant governor, for instance, or the governor general, right? By the same token, interestingly, in the Canadian construct, that then shifted, I would argue, conservative populism to focus more on the relative importance of the legislature vis-a-vis the executive because of the dominance for so many years of liberal governments. So the reform agenda of the late 80s and 1990s was a lot about curtailing the executive's authority vis-a-vis the legislature in order to give greater power to the people's representatives. And how did that manifest itself in terms of actual practices? Well, it actually ended up looking a lot like what people would argue is good constitutional form. So, for instance, the war prerogative, where in the Westminster tradition, the executive through the Crown prerogative is able to deploy military forces without consulting the legislature. This was a conservative innovation beginning in 2006 to bring these combat missions before the House of Commons for a vote. Similarly, the executive in the Westminster tradition is able to ratify treaties without consulting the legislature. Here again, in 2008, the Conservatives bring this new model. So the Conservatives under Stephen Harper, I mean, I think a lot of people tend to associate them with things, other forms of populism, such as harkening back to an older history or popular history around the War of 1812 and this type of thing. But here again, it's actually more of a Tory tradition that they took up. They were talking about the British connection, the crown, not the populist sense that we would find in other jurisdictions that very much emphasized, kind of the leveler piece. And the last thing I'll say about it is, again, a number of the initiatives that you might associate with populism can't really work in our constitutional construct because they face structural impediments. So even things like recall legislation or the current attempt to undermine the pension of the governor general, right, is going to face. It just doesn't work with the relationship between the institutions, and because they're just so anchored still in this long-standing Westminster construct, they have to adapt to that, and they end up having a form of populism which looks a little bit more like what we would consider to be republicanism against a constitutional monarchical construct. Over to you, Kelly.
I can't answer it in that much detail, but I mean, one thing is, you know, these questions about populism that have become like so frequent. And it's just so hard to understand sort of what populism is, right? So I think, you know, there's some trend towards thinking about populism as having like a morphology that has to attach to other ideologies, and that might be helpful. So it might be actually more helpful to think about populism in Canada as being like attached to kind of regional identities. You know, other people have argued it's like just a discursive structure. So like, you know, and that, I mean, that might be kind of lacking. But I think, yeah, it's hard to kind of pin down what populism is, which maybe makes it difficult to answer this question. But I think, you know, what we've also seen, I mean, populism in Western Canada is so interesting because it's like, it's populism sort of by the political elite, right? Preston Manning's father was like the longest serving premier of Alberta. So like, is he really like the people? You know, we see the same thing with Jason Kenney, who tends to invoke these kind of populist ideas and was, you know, a key minister under Stephen Harper. So I think in that way, the ways that political elites have stoked kind of Western alienation and Western populism is maybe an interesting dimension of that as well. I don't know that it's always something that is sort of, you know, swelling from below, but in some cases it's sort of coming from the political elite itself. And then I guess the final thing that I would say is like these like populist movements and parties, one, like they haven't always historically been attached to conservatism in the West. So we can think of the CCF, which then became the NDP, and this idea of kind of like prairie populism as being an example. But you know, when, you know, what happened with reform is that they were locked in to the Western provinces. So they actually had to abandon a lot of their populism in order to be electorally viable at the federal level. So, you know, one of the really, like, I kind of love to tell my students this story of like Preston Manning, when he was first leader of the Reform Party, was like, no, we're not going to take all these like special advantages that political elites take, and like we're not going to fly first class and all of these things, that it's going to be free speech. And then, you know, the reality of our parliamentary system and like the strong executive is that like that is not sustainable in Canadian politics, right? And so Preston Manning ended up having to kind of rule with an iron fist like all other leaders of political parties have to do in Canada. So I think it is really interesting. I think the ways that the kind of cycle of populist politics happen in the West, like they're kind of an interesting empirical entry point to thinking more largely about these questions of like how we should even understand populism.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Kelly, Professor Gordon, Philipe, Professor Lagassé, and Chris, Professor Manfredi, for this wonderful exchange.